So the second option for the first read is 80. And that is Solid Geometry by Ian McEwan. Hiya, Picky Mickey. Welcome to the stream. Nice to see you. Okay, yeah, I hope we're all doing well on this Sunday. Whether you're heading to bed over in Australia, that part of the world, and just trying to relax and get some sleep, or whether your day is pretty much just beginning over maybe on the west coast of North America. I hope you're doing well. Let's relax with a little bit of reading. This is totally unprepared, so we'll just see what comes. In Melton Mowbray in 1875, at an auction of articles of curiosity and worth, my great-grandfather, in the company of M, his friend, bid for the penis of Captain Nichols, who died in Horsemonger Jail in 1873. It was bottled in a glass, 12 inches long, and noted, my great-grandfather in his diary that night, in a beautiful state of preservation. Also for auction was the unnamed portion of the late Lady Barrymore. It went to Sam Israels for 50 guineas. My great-grandfather was keen on the idea of having the two items as a pair, and M dissuaded him. This illustrates perfectly their friendship. My great-grandfather, the excitable theorist, M, the man of action who knew when to bid at auctions. My great-grandfather lived for 69 years. For 45 of them, at the end of every day, he sat down before going to bed and wrote his thoughts in a diary. These diaries are on my table now, 45 volumes bound in calf leather, and to the left sits Captain Nichols in the glass jar. My great-grandfather lived on the income derived from the patent of an invention of his father, a handy fastener used by corset makers right up till the outbreak of the First World War. My great-grandfather liked gossip, numbers, and theories. He also liked tobacco, good port, jugged hare, and very occasionally opium. He liked to think of himself as a mathematician, though he never had a job and never published a book. Nor did he ever travel or get his name in the Times, even when he died. In 1869, he married Alice, only daughter of the Reverend Toby Shadwell, co-author of a not highly regarded book on English wildflowers. I believe my great-grandfather to have been a very fine diarist, and when I have finished editing the diaries and they are published, I am certain he will receive the recognition due to him. When my work is over, I will take a long holiday, travel somewhere cold and clean and treeless, Iceland or the Russian steppes. I used to think that at the end of it all I would try, if it was possible, to divorce my wife, Maisie, but now there is no need at all. Often Maisie would shout in her sleep, and I would have to wake her. "Put your arm around me," she would say. "It was a horrible dream. I had it once before. I was in a plane flying over a desert. But it wasn't really a desert. I took the plane lower, and I could see there were thousands of babies, heaped up, stretching away over the horizon, all of them naked and climbing over each other. I was running out of fuel, and I had to land the plane. I tried to find a space. I flew on and kept looking for a space. Go to sleep now, I said through a yawn. It was only a dream. No, she cried. I mustn't go to sleep. Not just yet. Well, I have to sleep now, I told her. I have to be up early in the morning. She shook my shoulder. Please don't go to sleep yet. Don't leave me here. I'm in the same bed, I said. I won't leave you. It makes no difference. Don't leave me awake. But my eyes were already closing. Lately, I've taken up my great-grandfather's habit. Before going to bed, I sit down for half an hour and think over the day. I have no mathematical whimsies or sexual theories to note down. Mostly, I write out what Maisie has said to me or what I have said to Maisie. Sometimes, for complete privacy, I lock myself in the bathroom, sit on the toilet seat and balance the writing pad on my knees. Apart from me there is occasionally a spider or two in the bathroom. They climb up the wastepipe and crouch perfectly still on the glaring white enamel. They must wonder where they have come to. After hours of crouching, they turn back, puzzled, or perhaps disappointed they could not learn more. As far as I can tell, my great-grandfather made only one reference to spiders. On May 8th, 1906, he wrote, "Bismarck is a spider." In the afternoons, Maisie used to bring me tea and tell me her nightmares. Usually I was going through old newspapers, compiling indexes, cataloguing items, putting down this volume, picking up another. Maisie said she was in a bad way. Recently she had been sitting around the house all day glancing at books on psychology and the occult, and almost every night she had had bad dreams. Since the time we exchanged physical blows, lying in wait to hit each other with the same shoe outside the bathroom, I had little sympathy for her. Part of her problem was jealousy. She was very jealous of my great-grandfather's 45-volume diary and of my purpose and energy in editing it. She was doing nothing. I was putting down one volume and picking up another when Maisie came in with the tea. "Can I tell you my dream?" she asked. "I was flying this plane over a kind of desert. Tell me later, Maisie," I said. "I'm in the middle of something here." After she had gone, I stared at the wall in front of my desk and thought about M, who came to talk and dine with my great-grandfather regularly over a period of 15 years, up until his sudden and unexplained departure one evening in 1898. M, whoever he might have been, was something of an academic, as well as a man of action. For example, on the evening of August 9th, 1870, the two of them are talking about positions for love-making, and M tells my great-grandfather that copulation a posteriori is the most natural way owing to the position of the clitoris and because other anthropoids favour this method. My great-grandfather, who copulated about half a dozen times in his entire life, and that with Alice during the first year of their marriage, wondered out loud what the Church's view was, and straightway M is able to tell him that the 7th century theologian Theodore considered copulation a posteriori a sin ranking with masturbation, and therefore worthy of 40 penances. Later in the same evening, my great-grandfather produced mathematical evidence that the number of positions cannot exceed the prime number 17. M scoffed at this, and told him he had seen a collection of drawings by Romano, a pupil of Raphael's, in which 24 positions were shown. And, he said, he had heard of Mr. F.K. Forberg, who had accounted for 90. By the time I remembered the tea Maisie had left by my elbow, it was cold. An important stage in the deterioration of our marriage was reached as follows. I was sitting in the bathroom one evening writing out a conversation Maisie and I had had about the tarot pack when suddenly she was outside, rapping on the door and rattling the door handle. "Open the door!" she called out. "I want to come in." I said to her, "You'll have to wait a few minutes more. I've almost finished." "Let me in now," she shouted. "You're not using the toilet." "Wait," I replied. and wrote another line or two. Now Maisie was kicking the door. "My period has started and I need to get something." I ignored her yells and finished my piece, which I considered to be particularly important. If I left it till later, certain details would be lost. There was no sound from Maisie now, and I assumed she was in the bedroom. But when I opened the door, she was standing right in my way with a shoe in her hand. She brought the heel of it sharply down on my head, and I only had time to move slightly to one side. The heel caught the top of my ear, and it cut badly. "There," said Maisie, stepping round me to get to the bathroom. "Now we are both bleeding." And she banged the door shut. I picked up the shoe and stood quietly and patiently outside the bathroom, holding a handkerchief to my bleeding ear. Maisie was in the bathroom about 10 minutes, and as she came out, I caught her neatly and squarely on the top of her head. I did not give her time to move. She stood perfectly still for a moment, looking straight into my eyes. "You worm!" she breathed, and went down to the kitchen to nurse her head out of my sight. During supper yesterday, Maisie claimed that a man locked in a cell with only the tarot cards would have access to all knowledge. She'd been doing a reading that afternoon, and the cards were still spread about the floor. "Could he work out the street plan of Valparaiso from the cards?" I asked. "You're being stupid," she replied. "Could it tell him the best way to start a laundry business? The best way to make an omelette or a kidney machine?" "Your mind is so narrow," she complained. "You're so narrow, so predictable." "Could he," I insisted, "tell me who M is, or why?" "Those things don't matter," she cried. "They're not necessary." "They're all still knowledge. Could he find them out?" She hesitated. "Yes, he could." I smiled and said nothing. "What's so funny?" she said. I shrugged, and she began to get angry. She wanted to be disproved. "Why do you ask all those pointless questions?" I shrugged again. "I just wanted to know if you really meant everything." Maisie banged the table and screamed. "Damn you! Why are you always trying me out? Why don't you say something real?" And with that, we both recognized we had reached the point where all our discussions led, and we became bitterly silent. Work on the diaries cannot proceed until I have cleared up the mystery surrounding M. After coming to dinner on and off for 15 years and supplying my great-grandfather with a mass of material for his theories, M simply disappears from the pages of the diary. On Tuesday, December 6th, my great-grandfather invited M to dine on the following Saturday, and although M came, my great-grandfather in the entry for that day simply writes, "M to dinner." On any other day, the conversation at these meals is recorded at great length. M had been to dinner on Monday, December 5th, and the conversation had been about geometry, and the entries for the rest of the week are entirely given over to the same subject. There is absolutely no hint of antagonism. Besides, my great-grandfather needed M. M provided his material. M knew what was going on. He was familiar with London, and he had been on the continent a number of times. He knew all about socialism and Darwin. He had an acquaintance in the free love movement, a friend of James Hinton. M was in the world in a way which my great-grandfather, who left Melton Mowbray only once in his lifetime to visit Nottingham, was not. Even as a young man, my great-grandfather preferred to theorize by the fireside. All he needed were the materials M supplied. For example, one evening in June 1884, M, who was just back from London, gave my great-grandfather an account of how the streets of the town were fouled and clogged by horse dung. Now, in that same week, my great-grandfather had been reading the essay by Malthus called On the Principle of Population. That night he made an excited entry in the diary about a pamphlet that he wanted to write and have published. It was to be called De Stercor Equorum. The pamphlet was never published and probably never written, but there are detailed notes in the diary entries for the 2 weeks following that evening. In De Stercor Equorum, concerning horse shit, he assumes geometric growth in the horse population, and working from detailed street plans he predicted that the metropolis would be impassable by 1935. By impassable he took to mean an average thickness of 1 foot, compressed, in every major street. He described involved experiments outside his own stables to determine the compressibility of horse dung, which he managed to express mathematically. It was all pure theory, of course. His results rested on the assumption that no dung would be shovelled aside in the 50 years to come. Very likely it was M who talked my great-grandfather out of the project. One morning, after a long dark night of Maisie's nightmares, we were laying side by side in bed, and I said, "What is it you really want? Why don't you go back to your job? These long walks, all this analysis, sitting around the house, lying in bed all morning, the tarot pack, the nightmares. What is it you want?" And she said, "I want to get my head straight," which she had said many times before. I said, "Your head, your mind, it's not like a hotel kitchen, you know. You can't throw stuff out like old tin cans. It's more like a river than a place, moving and changing all the time. You can't make rivers flow straight." "Don't go through all that again," she said. "I'm not trying to make rivers flow straight. I'm trying to get my head straight." "You've got to do something," I told her. "You can't do nothing. Why not go back to your job? You didn't have nightmares when you were working. You were never so unhappy when you were working." "I've got to stand back from all that," she said. "I'm not sure what any of it means." "Fashion," I said. "It's all fashion. Fashionable metaphors, fashionable reading, fashionable malaise. What do you care about Jung, for example? You've read 12 pages in a month." "Don't go on," she pleaded. "You know it leads nowhere." But I went on. "You've never been anywhere," I told her. "You've never done anything. You're a nice girl without even the blessing of an unhappy childhood. Your sentimental Buddhism, this junk shop mysticism, joss stick therapy, magazine astrology, none of it's yours. You've worked none of it out for yourself. You fell into it. You fell into a swamp of respectable intuitions. You haven't the originality or passion to intuit anything yourself beyond your own unhappiness. Why are you filling your mind with other people's mystic banalities and giving yourself nightmares?" I got out of bed, opened the curtains, and began to get dressed. "You talk like this was a fiction seminar," Maisie said. "Why are you trying to make things worse for me?" Self-pity began to well up from inside her, but she fought it down. "When you were talking," she went on, "I can feel myself, you know, being screwed up like a piece of paper." "Perhaps we are in a fiction seminar," I said grimly. Maisie sat up in bed, staring at her lap. Suddenly her tone changed. She patted the pillow beside her and said softly, "Come over here. Come and sit here. I want to touch you. I want you to touch me." But I was sighing and already on my way to the kitchen. In the kitchen I made myself some coffee and took it through to my study. It had occurred to me in my night of broken sleep that a possible clue to the disappearance of M might be found in the pages of geometry. I'd always skipped through them before because mathematics does not interest me. On the Monday, December 5th, 1898, Em and my great-grandfather discussed the Vescia Pisces, which apparently is the subject of Euclid's first proposition and a profound influence on the ground plans of many ancient religious buildings. I read through the account of the conversation carefully, trying to understand as best I could the geometry of it. Then, turning the page, I found a lengthy anecdote which Em told my great-grandfather that same evening when the coffee had been brought in and the cigars were lit. Just as I was beginning to read, Maisie came in. "And what about you?" she said, as if there had not been an hour break in our exchange. "All you have is books, crawling over the past like a fly on a turd." I was angry, of course, but I smiled and said cheerfully, "Crawling? Well, at least I'm moving." "You don't speak to me anymore," she said. "You play me like a pinball machine for points." "Good morning, Hamlet," I replied, and sat in my chair waiting patiently for what she had to say next. But she did not speak. She left, closing the study door softly behind her. In September 1870, Em began to tell my great-grandfather. "I came into the possession of certain documents which not only invalidate everything fundamental to our science of solid geometry, but also undermine the whole canon of our physical laws and force one to redefine one's place in nature's scheme. These papers outweigh in importance the combined work of Marx and Darwin. They were entrusted to me by a young American mathematician, and they are the work of David Hunter, a mathematician too, and a Scotsman. The American's name was Goodman. I had corresponded with his father over a number of years in connection with his work on the cyclical theory of menstruation, which, incredibly enough, is still widely discredited in this country. I met the young Goodman in Vienna, where, along with Hunter and mathematicians from a dozen countries, he'd been attending an international conference on mathematics. Goodman was pale and greatly disturbed when I met him, and planned to return to America the following day, even though the conference was not yet half complete. He gave the papers into my care, with the instructions that I was to deliver them to David Hunter if I was ever to learn of his whereabouts. And then, only after much persuasion and insistence on my part, he told me what he had witnessed on the third day of the conference. The conference met every morning at 9:30, when a paper was read and a general discussion ensued. At 11 o'clock refreshments were brought in, and many of the mathematicians would get up from the long, highly polished table round which they were all gathered, and stroll about the large, elegant room and engage in informal discussions with their colleagues. Now, the conference lasted 2 weeks, and by a long-standing arrangement, the most eminent of the mathematicians read their papers first, followed by the slightly less eminent, and so on, in a descending hierarchy throughout the 2 weeks, which caused, as it is wont to do among highly intelligent men, occasional but intense jealousies. Hunter, though a brilliant mathematician, was young and virtually unknown outside his university, which was Edinburgh. He had applied to deliver what he described as a very important paper on solid geometry, and since he was of little account in this pantheon, he was assigned to read to the conference on the last day but one, by which time many of the most important figures would have returned to their respective countries. And so, on the third morning, as the servants were bringing in the refreshments, Hunter stood up and suddenly addressed his colleagues just as they were rising from their seats. He was a large, shaggy man, and though young, he had about him a certain presence which reduced the hum of conversation to a complete silence. "Gentlemen," said Hunter. "I must ask you to forgive this improper form of address, but I have something to tell you of the utmost importance. I've discovered the plane without a surface." Amid derisive smiles and gentle bemused laughter, Hunter picked up from the table a large white sheet of paper. With a pocket knife, he made an incision along its surface about 3 inches long and slightly to one side of its centre. Then he made some rapid, complicated folds, and holding the paper aloft so all could see, he appeared to draw one corner of it through the incision, and as he did so, it disappeared. "Behold, gentlemen," said Hunter, holding out his empty hands towards the company, "the plane without a surface." Maisie came into my room, washed now and smelling faintly of perfumed soap. She came and stood behind my chair and placed her hands on my shoulders. "What are you reading?" she said. "Just bits of the diary which I haven't looked at before." She began to massage me gently at the base of my neck. I would have found it soothing if it had still been the first year of our marriage, but it was the 6th year, and it generated a kind of tension which communicated itself the length of my spine. Maisie wanted something. To restrain her, I placed my right hand on her left, and mistaking this for affection, she leaned forward and kissed under my ear. Her breath smelled of toothpaste and toast. She tugged at my shoulder. "Let's go in the bedroom," she whispered. "We haven't made love for nearly 2 weeks now." "I know," I replied. "You know how it is, with my work." I felt no desire for Maisie, or any other woman. All I wanted to do was turn the next page of my great-grandfather's diary, shoulder, and stood by my side. There was such a sudden ferocity in her silence that I found myself tensing like a sprinter on the starting line. She stretched forward and picked up the sealed jar containing Captain Nichols. As she lifted it, his penis drifted dreamily from one end of the glass to the other. "You're so complacent!" Maisie shrieked, just before she hurled the glass bottle at the wall in front of my table. Instinctively, I covered my face with my hand to shield off the shattering glass. As I opened my eyes, I heard myself saying, "Why did you do that? That belonged to my great-grandfather." Amid the broken glass and the rising stench of formaldehyde lay Captain Nichols, slouched across the leather cover of a volume of the diary, grey, limp, and menacing, transformed from a treasured curiosity into a horrible obscenity. "That was a terrible thing to do. Why did you do that?" I said again. "I'm going for a walk," Maisie replied, and slammed the door this time as she left the room. I did not move from my chair for a long time. Maisie had destroyed an object of great value to me. It had stood in his study while he lived, and then it had stood in mine, linking my life with his. I picked a few splinters of glass from my lap and stared at the 160-year-old piece of another human on my table. I looked at it and thought of all the homunculi which had swarmed down its length. I thought of all the places it had been: Cape Town, Boston, Jerusalem, travelling in the dark, fetid inside of Captain Nichols' leather breeches, emerging occasionally into the dazzling sunlight to discharge urine in some jostling public place. I thought also of all the things it had touched, all the molecules, of Captain Nichols' exploring hands on lonely, unrequited nights at sea, the sweating walls of cunts of young girls and old whores, Their molecules must still exist today, a fine dust blowing from Cheapside to Leicestershire. Who knows how long it might have lasted in its glass jar? I began to clear up the mess. I brought the rubbish bucket in from the kitchen. I swept and picked up all the glass I could find and swabbed up the formaldehyde. Then, holding him by just one end, I tried to ease Captain Nichols onto a sheet of newspaper. My stomach heaved as the foreskin began to come away in my fingers. Finally, with my eyes closed, I succeeded, and wrapping him carefully in the newspaper, I carried him into the garden and buried him under the geraniums. All this time I tried to prevent my resentment towards Maisie filling my mind. I wanted to continue with M's story. Back in my chair, I dabbed at a few spots of formaldehyde, which had blotted the ink, and read on. For as long as a minute, the room was frozen, and with each successive second it appeared to freeze harder. The first to speak was Dr. Stanley Rose of Cambridge University, who had much to lose by Hunter's plane without a surface. His reputation, which was very considerable indeed, rested upon his principles of solid geometry. "How dare you, sir? How dare you insult the dignity of this assembly with a worthless conjurer's trick?" And bolstered by the rising murmur of concurrence behind him, he added, "You should be ashamed, young man, thoroughly ashamed." With that, the room erupted like a volcano. With the exception of young Goodman, and of the servants who still stood by the refreshments, the whole room turned on Hunter, and directed at him a senseless babble of denunciation, invective, and threat. Some thumped on the table in their fury, others waved their clenched fists. One very frail German gentleman fell to the floor in an apoplexy and had to be helped to a chair. And there stood Hunter, firm and outwardly unmoved, his head inclined slightly to one side, his fingers resting lightly on the surface of the long polished table. That such an uproar should follow a worthless conjurer's trick clearly demonstrated the extent of the underlying unease, and Hunter surely appreciated this. Raising his hand, and the company falling suddenly silent once more, he said, "Gentlemen, your concern is understandable, and I will effect another proof, the ultimate proof." This said, he sat down and removed his shoes, stood up and removed his jacket, and then called for a volunteer to assist him, at which Goodman came forward. Hunter strode through the crowd to a couch which stood along one of the walls, and while he settled himself upon it, he told the mystified Goodman that when he returned to England, he should take with him Hunter's papers, and keep them there until he came to collect them. When the mathematicians had gathered round the couch, Hunter rolled onto his stomach and clasped his hands behind his back in a strange posture to fashion a hoop with his arms. He asked Goodman to hold his arms in that position for him, and rolled on his side, where he began a number of strenuous jerking movements which enabled him to pass one of his feet through the hoop. He asked his assistant to turn him on his other side, where he performed the same movements again, and succeeded in passing his other foot between his arms, and at the same time bent his trunk in such a way that his head was able to pass through the hoop in the opposite direction to his feet. With the help of his assistant, he began to pass his legs and head past each other through the hoop made by his arms. It was then that the distinguished assembly vented as one man a single yelp of utter incredulity. Hunter was beginning to disappear, and now as his legs and head passed through, his arms with greater facility seemed even to be drawn through by some invisible power. He was almost gone. And now he was gone. Quite gone. And nothing remained. M's story put my great-grandfather in a frenzy of excitement. In his diary that night he recorded how he tried to prevail upon my guest to send for the papers upon the instant, even though it was by now 2 o'clock in the morning. M, however, was more sceptical about the whole thing. Americans, he told my great-grandfather, often indulge in fantastic tales. But he agreed to bring along the papers the following day. As it turned out, M did not dine with my great-grandfather that night because of another engagement, but he called round in the late afternoon with the papers. Before he left, he told my great-grandfather he had been through them a number of times, and there was no sense to be had out of them. He did not realise then how much he was underestimating my great-grandfather as an amateur mathematician. Over a glass of sherry in front of the drawing-room fire, the two men arranged to dine again at the end of the week, on Saturday. For the next 3 days my great-grandfather hardly paused from his reading of Hunter's theorems to eat or sleep. The diary is full of nothing else. The pages are covered with scribbles, diagrams, and symbols. It seems that Hunter had to devise a new set of symbols, virtually a whole new language, to express his ideas. By the end of the second day, my great-grandfather had made his first breakthrough. At the bottom of a page of mathematical scribble, he wrote, Dimensionality is a function of consciousness. Turning to the entry for the next day, I read the words, It disappeared in my hands. He had re-established the plane without a surface, and there, spread out in front of me, were step-by-step instructions on how to fold the piece of paper. Turning the next page, I suddenly understood the mystery of M's disappearance. Undoubtedly encouraged by my great-grandfather, he had taken part in a scientific experiment, probably in a spirit of great scepticism. For here my great-grandfather had drawn a series of small sketches, illustrating what, at first glance, looked like yoga poses. Clearly, they were the secret of Hunter's disappearing act. My hands were trembling as I cleared a space on my desk. I selected a clean sheet of typing paper and laid it in front of me. I fetched a razor blade from the bathroom. I rummaged in a drawer and found an old pair of compasses, sharpened a pencil, and fitted it in. I searched through the house till I found an accurate steel ruler I had once used for fitting window panes, and then I was ready. First, I had to cut the paper to size. The piece that Hunter had so casually picked up from the table had obviously been carefully prepared beforehand. The length of the sides had to express a specific ratio. Using the compasses, I found the centre of the paper, and through this point I drew a line parallel to one of the sides and continued it right to the edge. Then I had to construct a rectangle whose measurements bore a particular relation to those of the sides of the paper. The centre of this rectangle occurred on the line in such a way as to dissect it by the golden mean. From the top of this rectangle I drew intersecting arcs, again of specified proportionate radii. This operation was repeated at the lower end of the rectangle, and when the 2 points of intersection were joined, I had the line of incision. Then I started work on folding the lines. Each line seemed to express, in its length, angle of incline, and point of intersection with other lines, some mysterious inner harmony of numbers. As I intersected arcs, drew lines, and made folds, I felt I was blindly operating a system of the highest, most terrifying form of knowledge, the mathematics of the absolute. By the time I had made the final fold, the piece of paper was the shape of a geometric flower, with 3 concentric rings arranged around the incision at the centre. There was something so tranquil and perfect about this design, something so remote and compelling, that as I stared into it, I found myself going into a light trance, and my mind becoming clear and inactive. I shook my head and glanced away. It was now time to turn the flower in on itself and pull it through the incision. This was a delicate operation, and now my hands were trembling again. Only by staring into the centre of the design could I calm myself. With my thumbs I began to push the sides of the paper flower towards the centre, and as I did so I felt a numbness settle over the back of my skull. I pushed a little further. The paper glowed whiter for an instant, and then it seemed to disappear. I say seemed, because at first I could not be sure whether I could feel it still in my hands and not see it, or see it but not feel it, or whether I could sense it had disappeared while its external properties remained. The numbness had spread right across my head and shoulders. My senses seemed inadequate to grasp what was happening. Dimensionality is a function of consciousness, I thought. I brought my hands together, and there was nothing between them. But even when I opened them again and saw nothing, I could not be sure the paper flower had completely gone. An impression remained, an after image, not on the retina, but on the mind itself. Just then the door opened behind me, and Maisie said, "What are you doing?" I returned as if from a dream to the room and to the faint smell of formaldehyde. It was a long, long time ago now, the destruction of Captain Nichols, but the smell revived my resentment, which spread through me like the numbness. Maisie slouched in the doorway, muffled in a thick coat and woolen scarf. She seemed a long way off, and as I looked at her, my resentment merged into a familiar weariness of our marriage. I thought, why did she break the glass? Because she wanted to make love? Because she wanted a penis? Because she was jealous of my work and wanted to smash the connection it had with my great-grandfather's life? "Why did you do it?" I said out loud, involuntarily. Maisie snorted. She had opened the door and found me hunched over the table, staring at my hands. "Have you been sitting there all afternoon?" she asked. "Thinking about that?" She giggled. "What happened to it, anyway? Did you suck it off?" "I buried it," I said, "under the geraniums." She came into the room a little way and said in a serious tone, "I'm sorry about that, I really am. I just did it before I knew what was happening. Do you forgive me?" I hesitated, and then, because my weariness had blossomed into a sudden resolution, I said, "Yes, of course I forgive you. It was only a prick in pickle." And we both laughed. Maisie came over to me and kissed me, and I returned the kiss, prizing open her lips with my tongue. "Are you hungry?" she said, when we were done with kissing. "Shall I make you some supper?" "Yes," I said. "I would love that." Maisie kissed me on the top of my head and left the room, while I turned back to my studies, resolving to be as kind as I could there's a mistake there, I think. Resolving to be as kind as I possibly could to Maisie that evening. Later we sat in the kitchen eating the meal Maisie had cooked and getting mildly drunk on a bottle of wine. We smoked a joint, the first one we had had together in a very long time. Maisie told me how she was going to get a job with the Forestry Commission planting trees in Scotland next summer, and I told Maisie about a conversation M and my great-grandfather had had about a posteriori, and about my great-grandfather's theory that there could be not more than the prime number 17 positions for making love. We both laughed, and Maisie squeezed my hand, and love-making hung in the air between us, in the warm fog of the kitchen. Then we put our coats on and went for a walk. It was almost a full moon. We walked along the main road which runs outside our house, and then turned down a narrow street of tightly packed houses, with immaculate and minute front gardens. We did not talk much, but our arms were linked, and Maisie told me how very stoned and happy she was. We came to a small park which was locked, and we stood outside the gates looking up at the moon through the almost leafless branches. When we came home, Maisie took a leisurely hot bath while I browsed in my study, checking on a few details. Our bedroom is a warm, comfortable room, luxurious in its way. The bed is 7 foot by 8, and I made it myself in the first year of our marriage. Maisie made the sheets, dyed them a deep rich blue, and embroidered the pillowcases. The only light in the room shone through a rough, old goatskin lampshade Maisie bought from a man who came to the door. It was a long time since I had taken an interest in the bedroom. We lay side by side in the tangle of sheets and rugs, Maisie voluptuous and drowsy after her bath and stretched full out, and I propped up on my elbow. Maisie said sleepily, "I was walking along the river this afternoon. The trees are beautiful now. The oaks, the elms. There are 2 copper beeches about a mile past the footbridge. You should see them now. Oh, that feels good." I'd eased her onto her belly and was caressing her back as she spoke. "There are blackberries, the biggest ones I've ever seen, growing all along the path, and elderberries too. I'm going to make some wine this autumn." I leaned over her and kissed the nape of her neck and brought her arms behind her back. She liked to be manipulated in this way, and she submitted warmly. "And the river is really still," she was saying. "You know, reflecting the trees, and the leaves are dropping into the river. Before the winter comes, we should go there together by the river, in the leaves. I found this little place. No one goes there." Holding Maisie's arms in position with one hand, I worked her legs towards the hoop with the other. "I sat in this place for half an hour without moving, like a tree. I saw a water rat running along the opposite bank and different kinds of ducks landing on the river and taking off. I heard these plopping noises in the river, but I didn't really know what they were, and I saw 2 orange butterflies. They almost came on my hand." When I had her legs in place, Maisie said, "Position number 18, and we both laughed softly. "Let's go there tomorrow, to the river," said Maisie, as I carefully eased her head towards her arms. "Careful, careful, that hurts!" she suddenly shouted, and tried to struggle. But it was too late now. Her head and legs were in place in the hoop of her arms, and I was beginning to push them through, past each other. "What's happening?" cried Maisie. Now the positioning of her limbs expressed the breathtaking beauty, the nobility of the human form, and, as in the paper flower, there was the fascinating power in its symmetry. I felt the trance coming on again, and the numbness settling over the back of my head. As I drew her arms and legs through, Maisie appeared to turn in on herself like a sock. "Oh, God!" she sighed. "What's happening?" And her voice sounded very far away. Then she was gone. And not gone. Her voice was quite tiny. "What's happening?" And all that remained was the echo of her question above the deep blue sheets. Okay, so that is option 1, A Lecture Tour by Knut Hamsun. And I will spin again. $84. So a more recent work near the back of the book. And that is Unseen Translation by Kate Atkinson. Yeah, interesting. It starts with some Greek. I'm guessing the name of this little hymn is Unseen Translation. I don't know if my webcam can pick this up. It's not great at text, like close text. But you'll see it here. And then there's the English translation here. So this is where I will begin. All right. Thank you for being here, everybody. Let's see what we make of this second story, which will be Unseen Translation by Kate Atkinson. I hope you're all doing well. I sing of Artemis, whose shafts are of gold, who cheers on the hounds, the pure maiden, shooter of stags, who delights in archery. That's a Homeric hymn to Artemis. They had managed an entire afternoon in the bird gallery. From egg to skeleton, from common to extinct, from flightless to free, Missy and Arthur were on familiar terms with the avian world. "Can we come back and do mammals tomorrow?" Arthur asked. "If you like. There are a lot of them, though, remember? You might want to subdivide them into categories." "There were a lot of birds. We didn't subdivide them." "True." Missy believed that knowledge was best taken in small, digestible portions. Museums and galleries, in her opinion, were full of people wandering listlessly from exhibit to exhibit, their eyes glazed over with too much information and not enough knowledge. "It's an established neurological fact," Missy told Arthur. Missy believed in using long words with children whenever possible. "That window shopping and museums are the two most tiring activities for the brain. A chronic insomniac could probably come into the Natural History Museum and fall asleep before he'd got past the Diplodocus in the central hall." Arthur yawned. "I've noticed you're very suggestible, Arthur." "Is that bad?" "No, it's a good thing. It makes my job much easier. Just make sure it's me that you take suggestions from, not someone else." The words, "like your mother," remained unspoken, but understood between them. The Natural History Museum was closing, already echoing with emptiness and a promise of the secret life it led when no one was there. Missy imagined the birds shaking out their feathers and shuffling from one stiff leg to the other, cracking neck bones and easing off flight muscles. Diplodocus himself gave a little tidal tremor along the vertebrae of his huge backbone, as if warming up for a leisurely evening stroll. They took no notice of him. Missy never bothered her charges too much with dinosaurs. She thought children, not to mention parents, were far too obsessed with them already. Outside, the threat of summer rain had darkened the South Kensington sky to an otherworldly purple. "Are we going home?" Arthur asked, rather indifferently. "No, we're going to Patisserie Valerie for hot chocolate and cake, unless you don't like that idea." Ha ha. Missy and Arthur had spent Arthur's school holidays picking and choosing from the capital's smorgasbord of culture. This week, for example, had begun with a short visit to the British Museum, where they spent most of their time admiring Jennings' dog. Followed on Tuesday by a Mozart string quartet at the Wigmore Hall. Wednesday was Shakespeare in the Park. As You Like It. Very good, in Arthur's opinion. And yesterday it had been the 18th century rooms of the National Gallery. Missy was pleased to find that Arthur was able to spend almost 20 minutes in near silent contemplation of Whistle Jacket. It was at that moment, as they sat companionably together, considering Stubbs' huge ideal of a horse, "essence of horse," Missy whispered in Arthur's ear, that Missy knew for certain that Arthur was a superior version of an 8-year-old boy. Unfortunately, children were usually spoilt for life by the time Missy got her hands on them. At 2 years old, they had acquired all the faults that would mar them forever, and Missy had to spend most of her time rectifying their old bad habits rather than instilling new good ones. Of course, that was why Missy was called in. She had a reputation like a Jesuitical troubleshooter, a Marine Corps Mary Poppins. When all else failed, call in Missy Clark. They expected her to drop in from the skies on the end of an umbrella, like a parachutist floating into a country in the middle of a civil war and rescue their children from bad behaviour. Missy was tiring of this phase of her life. She was even thinking of returning to nursing, although not to the hellish half-world of the NHS. She was considering applying to a private clinic somewhere, plastic surgery perhaps, somewhere where people weren't actually ill. If she was to remain in this job beyond the age of 40, she was 38, a difficult age, then she needed a completely blank canvas on which to practice her art. A tabula rasa, untouched by another's hand. A new baby. That was what Romney Wright had offered. A baby so untouched that it wasn't even born yet. Missy was never interviewed by an employer. She interviewed them. Not that she was looking for the perfect family. Years of experience had taught her there was no such thing. All she wanted was a family capable of reformation, and failing that, then just one child in the family who could be rescued from the fate which awaited it. Ordinariness. Missy made it a rule never to stay anywhere longer than 2 years. "Think of me as the SAS," she said brightly, when the hugely pregnant Romney had engaged her 2 weeks before the birth of her second child. Romney, sometime wife of a rock star, glamour model, and ironic game show guest, now concentrating on her acting career, but mostly famous for being famous, forgot to mention the first child until Missy was dictating her non-negotiable terms and conditions. Own bedroom, kitchen, bathroom and sitting room, own car, 1.5 days off a week, no nights, full-time maternity nurses for the first 3 months, pension allowance. In fact, it was only by chance that Arthur wandered into the room at that moment and asked Romney if anyone was going to make his tea, or should he heat up some baked beans. Missy was pleased at this. She liked to see a self-sufficient child, and had nothing against baked beans. "Oh, and of course this is Arthur," Romney said carelessly in a grating kind of East London accent that was already beginning to annoy Missy. Hadn't elocution lessons been on the curriculum at Romney's stage school? Missy did actually know about Arthur's existence, as she had checked out Romney's entirely tabloid cuttings file. My love for my little boy, my single-parent hell, and so on, before arriving at Romney's Primrose Hill house. "This is the new nanny, Arthur," Romney said. "Oh," Arthur said, raising surprised eyebrows. Missy liked a child who didn't speak when he had nothing to say. "Missy," Missy said to Arthur. "Missy?" Romney repeated thoughtfully. "What kind of name is that?" "A nickname my father gave me. It stuck." "Right. Well, Arthur's called Arthur because his dad was into, like, Camelot and all that stuff." "I think it's a very good name," Missy said, smiling encouragingly at Arthur. "It's a bit old-fashioned, though, isn't it?" Romney frowned. "I mean, Arthur Wright sounds like your granddad or something, but that was his dad all over. Thought it was funny. His dad's Campbell Wright, lead singer with Bowick. Useless piece of Scottish string, completely debauched, the lot of 'em." Romney pronounced debauched with relish, as if it was only recently learned. Arthur, a solemn, bespectacled boy, said nothing. Missy had already looked up Bowick on the internet. Romney was surprisingly accurate in her choice of vocabulary. Bowick were debauched. In photographs, they all wore Second World War gas masks, so it was impossible to see if Arthur looked like his father. He certainly didn't resemble his mother, at least not in any major particular. Perhaps in the wall of an ear, the oval of a nostril. Nothing too relevant. "What would you have called him?" Missy asked, intrigued by the idea that you could be the mother of a child and not name it. "Zeus," Romney said, without hesitation. "Zeus? King of the gods?" Romney explained helpfully. Arthur looked at Missy with absolutely no expression on his face. Missy liked a child who kept his own counsel. "He wears glasses, of course," Romney sighed. "Arthur, not Zeus, obviously. When I was a kid," she carried on, when neither Arthur nor Missy had anything to add to this observation, "if you wore glasses, you were like Specky Four Eyes or Double Glazing. But now it's cool, like because of Harry Potter. And that kid in that Tom Cruise film. Oh no, maybe not him. I don't think that kid was cool, was he? Of course, Campbell was very romantic then. Now he's a wanker, but you should have seen our wedding. He planned it all himself, in a ruined castle. I rode over the drawbridge on a white horse, and when we were pronounced man and wife, although it wasn't really a vicar, it was more of a shaman kind of bloke, they released butterflies, hundreds of butterflies over our heads. It was really something. I never thought..." Missy stood up abruptly. She could see that Romney was a talker. "I have to go now," she said. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow," Arthur said promptly. Missy was pleased to hear that he spoke a more civilized form of the English language than his mother. "He's a funny one, isn't he?" Romney said, for no particular reason. Missy allowed Arthur 2 cakes with his hot chocolate. She understood that sometimes one simply wasn't enough. "What do you think she'll call the baby?" Arthur asked. "Who are we talking about? The cat's mother? Wipe your fingers." "You know who I mean. I bet it's something stupid." Romney had been delivered of a baby girl the previous day, and Missy and Arthur had visited her that morning in the hospital, in the private maternity wing, and split open rather than... Romney had been delivered of a baby girl the previous day, and Missy and Arthur had visited her that morning in the hospital, in the private maternity wing that was like a 5-star hotel. Romney had opted to be knocked unconscious and split open, rather than give birth naturally. Missy favoured natural childbirth wherever possible. She thought it was character-forming for a child to have to fight its way into existence. Missy herself was a twin, and had made sure she'd elbowed her way out first, ahead of her brother. The father of Romney's baby was a multi-millionaire, Swiss-born financier who had led an impeccably boring life until a lifelong interest in West End musicals had led him to bankroll a doomed stage version of Charlotte Bronte's Villette, in which Romney had a small and surprisingly naked part. In a moment of champagne and cocaine-fueled incontinence at the opening night party, the Swiss financier had found himself in a backstage dressing room toilet having frantic sex with Romney, a fact which he subsequently vehemently denied when it became tabloid knowledge. "I am a love god," Otto shouted in our steamy sex session. Romney was now looking forward to the DNA test to see just how wealthy Otto's seed would prove. "I'm glad it's a girl," Arthur said, finishing off his second cake. Both his chosen cakes had been chocolate. "I like girls. Do you know I used to have a male nanny once?" "And? Was he all right?" So. He was Australian." "How many nannies have you had, Arthur?" "5, I think." "Why do they leave?" "Not because of you. You're not a difficult child." "Thank you." "What about the last one, my predecessor?" Arthur shrugged. "What does that mean, the shrugging?" Arthur stood up and piled their dirty plates neatly. "We should go. The tube's going to be packed." The rain held off as they walked to the underground. Missy thought it was important for a child to use public transport, to suffer dreary queues and biting winds. Even when working for the richest families, she had made a point of hauling their children around the streets of London on buses and tubes and trains. She believed stoicism was a virtue that was badly in need of reviving. They went into a newsagent so that Missy could replenish essentials. She was never without elastoplasts, safety pins, first-class stamps, tissues, extra strong mints, Nurofen, cough sweets, Calpol, bottled water. The search for tissues led them past the newspaper and magazine racks, which took up one wall. All of the top shelf was occupied by glossy girls presenting their buttocks or breasts to the camera. Difficult though it may be for you to believe, one day, sadly, you will probably find these images attractive, Missy told Arthur. But for now you can buy a Beano. Arthur wasn't listening. "Look," he said, pointing to the rack of tabloids beneath the naked women. Nearly every newspaper had a photograph of Romney Wright on the front, posing in her hospital bed. "Romney's bundle of joy. Love rat leaves Romney holding the baby. Romney keeping mum about dad." which was hardly true. Romney had managed to adopt a pose similar to the models in the pornographic magazines, her huge milk-swollen breasts offered to the camera like gifts. The baby itself seemed incidental, almost invisible inside its shawl cocoon. Arthur skim-read the text. "They don't mention me," he said. "That's a good thing." "I know." Arthur gazed at the photographs of his mother as if she was an interesting stranger. "Do you think we'll like the baby?" "What's not to like?" Arthur gazed at his overexposed mother. Missy liked a wise child better than anyone, but she considered the expression on Arthur's face to be knowledgeable, well beyond his years. "I realise you've already had far too much chocolate today and are probably as high as a kite, which is a technical term used by nannies, but against my better judgment, and you will rarely hear those words from my lips, Arthur, you can have a packet of chocolate buttons. Now come on, don't dawdle." The baby was finally named. Romney toyed with a galaxy of goddesses, Athena, Aphrodite, Artemis, and gave up before reaching the end of the alphas. "What did they do?" Arthur asked as they meandered, from the river god Meander, by the way, through the textile rooms of the V&A. "Well," Missy said, "Athena was smug and thought she knew everything. Aphrodite was a troublemaker and very irritating. And very irritating, I might add, and only Artemis had any sense." "What did she do?" "Virgin, close relationship with the moon, childbirth, wolves. Oh, and the chase." "The chase?" "Shot stags with silver arrows, that kind of thing." Arthur looked horrified. "Shot stags?" he echoed. From Echo, an unfortunate nymph. Show me one that isn't. It's a mythic thing. No stags were actually harmed during that kind of thing." Romney had offered the choice of name to Arthur, but reneged when he opted for Jane, a name far too plain for Romney's tastes. In the end, she went for world geography. Romney's sister, Jodie, had a child called Africa, and her friend Lily had a baby called India, so Romney decided on China for Arthur's sister. "Like collecting countries," she said to Missy. "They'll be like NATO or something when they grow up." "It could have been much worse," Missy said to Arthur. "Belgium, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Gibraltar, Uzbekistan. The list of worse is endless. That's not grammatical, by the way." China, although in no way Chinese, was as delicate as porcelain, with creamy skin and a rosy blush on her cheeks. She was more robust than her name implied, but nevertheless received round-the-clock attention from a series of maternity nurses who themselves received round-the-clock attention from the nanny cam in the nursery. Romney had a monitor in her bedroom so that she could watch the nurse watching her baby. Otto's DNA had finally been forced to own up as the culprit. Kraut comes clean. China's mine. Much to Romney's relief, although he wasn't a kraut, she said indignantly. Autumn came. The Primrose Hill household was running smoothly. Romney was sated with money and sex, the sex in the stocky form of a soap star. Arthur was as happy as an 8-year-old boy can be at school. Okay, I suppose. And China was a dream of a child. Even the tabloid photographers had stopped camping on the doorstep, and Missy was looking forward to the school break and some leaf-kicking time in London's parks with Arthur and the baby, when Romney suddenly announced that Arthur was going to visit his father for half-term. "They have joint custody," Arthur explained over a boiled egg tea down in the huge basement kitchen. And when did you last see him? Arthur thought for a long time. 2 years, I think. You have to come with me, he added matter-of-factly. Why? Because he's on tour. On tour? Oh yeah, didn't I say? Romney said when Missy questioned her. BOAC are in the middle of, this huge world tour. Actually, I think they're always on it. Arthur's going to visit him when they're in Germany, flying into Munich, flying out of Hamburg at the end of the week. All the arrangements have been made by his publicist. You're going to... Oh, all the arrangements have been made by his publicist. You're going too. And I tell you what, I'm going to give you your own credit card. How's that? One more thing for the crowd to pay for. He's Swiss, Missy reminded her. Same difference, Romney said. What about my hamster? Arthur asked Missy. We'll ask Africa to look after him. What about the baby? It's only a week, Missy said, and babies are almost indestructible, you know. Romney, however, decided not to look after China herself, but to go on a detox meditation in the Cotswolds with her friend Lily, while China went to stay with her maternal grandmother, who had, in Romney's words, been dying to get a shot at her. So China will be fine, Missy reassured Arthur. After all, your grandmother managed to bring your mother up. Arthur gave Missy the most beautifully blank look. You can be very enigmatic sometimes, Arthur, Missy said. From the Greek, enigma, derived from anos, fable. If they were on their way to partake of BOAC's debauchery, there was no indication of it in Lufthansa business class, which was so clean and grey and lacking in decadence that Arthur, a nonchalant traveller, managed to study the Collins German phrase book that Missy had bought him in an Oxford shop prior to the trip. Why buy new, she said to Arthur, when you can buy cheap? While Missy herself read a book about astronomy that she had taken out from the library. Missy thought it was important to use libraries. Why buy at all when you can borrow? She wasn't particularly interested in astronomy, but she believed an important part of her job was to impart as much general knowledge as possible to her charges, because if not her, then who? Did you know, Missy asked Arthur, that they can weigh galaxies? Sei führen mich an, Arthur said, consulting his phrase book. I'm sorry? You're pulling my leg, he laughed, pleased that he knew something that Missy didn't. Missy and Arthur were in possession of an extraordinarily detailed itinerary for the German leg of BOAC's tour, prepared by the band's publicist, a girl called Lulu, who, as well as providing flight times, driver details and hotel reservations, had also given 2 different mobile numbers on which she could be contacted. The itinerary also informed them that they were going to travel around Germany on BOAC's tour bus. What will that be like? Missy asked Arthur, as the plane bumped lightly onto the runway at Munich airport. Arthur frowned, carefully searching for the right word. Extreme, he said finally. There was no car to collect them at the airport, as promised by Lulu, but Missy had changed sterling into Deutschmarks at Heathrow, and they caught a taxi to the hotel with the careless abandon of people on someone else's expenses. The Bayerischer Hof had no record of any reservation. 2 rooms, in the name of right? Missy persisted, showing the receptionist Lulu's careful itinerary. The receptionist regarded it politely, as if it was a document from another civilization, far away in time and space and beyond translation. Are BOAC actually staying here? Missy asked, wishing they weren't called such a stupid name. At first the receptionist thought she was trying to say book, and then Bjork. The smile on the receptionist's face grew stiff and tired. She called the manager. "What does Boak mean, anyway?" Missy asked Arthur as they waited. "It's Scottish for sick." "Ill sick or vomit sick?" "Vomit sick." The manager reappeared, smiling sadly, and said that he very much regretted, but the hotel never revealed details about its guests. It was growing late by now, and Missy felt an uncharacteristic reluctance for battle. Arthur was sitting on their luggage, looking like a weary refugee, and Missy decided they would take a room anyway. She offered the brand new gold credit card Rodney had given her before they left. A few minutes later, the hotel manager returned it to her and said, in a low murmur, that he was very sorry, but the card was not acceptable. He smiled even more sadly. Missy paid for the room on her own card. "How much money do you have?" Arthur asked. "Quite a lot, actually," Missy said truthfully. "I've been saving for years." "But you're not supposed to be paying." "True, but it's only for one night. I expect your father'll turn up tomorrow." "Das ist Pech," Arthur consoled. The room was nice, although not the luxury suite promised by Lulu. The floors were clean and the sheets snappy with starch. Missy ordered cheese omelettes and apfelstrudel on room service. After they had eaten, she phoned both the mobile numbers that Lulu had provided. One was completely dead. The other announced something impenetrable in a German that was well beyond the capacity of the phrase book. Missy phoned Romney's Primrose Hill number, but there was no answer. On Romney's mobile, a voice announced that it might not be switched on. They filled in their breakfast cards. Arthur found this very exciting, and then watched an incomprehensible game show on television that even if they had been fluent in German, they probably wouldn't have understood. They went to their beds at 9 o'clock German time, 8 o'clock Primrose Hill time, and they both slept as soundly as babies until the maid hammered on the door with their breakfast, long after the dawn had scattered her yellow robes across the skies. After breakfast, which Arthur liked almost as much as the ordering of it, Missy tried all the phone numbers she had tried the previous evening, with the same result. "Es sind schlechte Zeiten," Arthur said, leafing industriously through his phrase book. "Wie schade." Missy went down to reception and looked the sadly smiling manager in the eye in the same way that she looked at little boys when she particularly wanted them to tell her the truth. "If you were me," she said to him, "and think about this carefully, would you stay another night in this unbelievably expensive hotel and wait for the band known, unfortunately, as Boak to turn up?" "No," he said. "I wouldn't. Thank you." "Look at it this way," Missy said to Arthur. "Our flight from Hamburg isn't for another week. We have enough money, even if it's mine, and we are in one of the great cultural cities of Western Europe in the half-term holidays, so we may as well enjoy ourselves." They moved into a guest house on Karlstrasse, although they returned several times to the Bayerischer Hof to check that Boak hadn't suddenly materialized. "Hat jemand nach uns gefragt?" Arthur asked the sad manager. "No," he replied in English. They hadn't. They trekked to the Olympia Halle and discovered a tour poster slashed with a banner in large red capitals, declaring that Boak's concert was entfällt. "I think that means cancelled," Arthur said without bothering to consult the German dictionary she had bought. Sometimes you have no choice but to buy. After that, they didn't bother returning to the Bayerischer Hof. Lulu and Romney remained unreachable by all means. "Perhaps we're dead," Arthur suggested, "and we just don't know it." "I think that's a rather fanciful explanation," Missy said. In accord with Missy's beliefs, they visited museums and galleries in moderation. The Forum de Technik, but only the planetarium. The Deutsches Museum, but only the coal mine. The Alte Pinakothek, but only pre-16th century paintings. Arthur stayed awake for the whole of the BMW Museum. He wasn't an 8-year-old boy for nothing, but was asleep on his feet within minutes of going into the Residence Museum. The Frauenkirche and the Peterskirche had much the same effect on them. An expedition to the Schloss Nypenburg might have been more of a success if it hadn't rained so much. Their favourite museum exhibit was a chance discovery, a stuffed creature in the oddly named Jagd- und Fischerei Museum. Hunting and fishing, Arthur supplied helpfully. The Wolpertinger was a curious Mittel-European chimera, a mix of rabbit, stag, and duck, plus something less definable and more frightening. Distantly related to the rare wolfkin, Mrs. said. Bavarian primeval creature, Arthur read from the guidebook the sad hotel manager had given them on their last visit to the Bayerischer Hof. In truth, neither of them was much in the mood for history and culture, and they spent a lot of time wandering in the Englischer Garten or drinking hot chocolate. Every day at midday they went and stood ritualistically in front of the Glockenspiel on the Neusch Rathaus. My German is non-existent. I feel like I should be able to pronounce this. It can't be news. Neusch Rathaus, and watched for all the brightly coloured figures to make their rounds. "What did happen to your last nanny?" Missy asked as they waited for the Glockenspiel to start. Arthur made a pinched sort of face. "What?" Missy encouraged. "She was murdered. She killed herself. She came back as a ghost and wandered round a lake. Fell in love with the master who had a mad wife in the attic and who became hideously disfigured in a fire." "You're not supposed to talk like that to 8-year-olds. "Sorry." "She left." "Left?" "Left. She said she wouldn't leave, and she did. And I liked her." Arthur stuck his hands in his pockets and angrily kicked an imaginary stone on the ground. "I liked her, and she promised she wouldn't leave, and she did. And you'll leave." His face began to quiver, and he kicked the ground harder. His shoe was getting scuffed. Missy tried to touch the small shoulders, heaving with suppressed tears, but Arthur grew suddenly hysterical and shook her off. "You'll leave just like she did," he screamed. "You'll leave me, and I hate you. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you." "Arthur." "Shut up, shut up, shut up," he yelled, so wound up now that he could hardly breathe, and several passers-by regarded with curiosity the small English boy struggling furiously to escape his mother's grip. "It feels as though we've been away for years," Arthur said when the cab dropped them off at Munich airport. "I know. Do you think anyone's missed us? Can you see the Lufthansa sales desk? Over there." Arthur, Missy was relieved to see, was quite calm today, although his eyes were still red from crying. He had sobbed for hours, long after Missy had got him back to the Karlstrasse guest house, long after she had put him to bed with milk and honey cake offered by the sympathetic proprietress. "Die Kinder," she sighed, as if to be a child was the worst thing in the world. Arthur had finally fallen asleep, flushed and tear-stained, clutching onto Missy's hand. "I don't hate you, you know," he said with a grief-stricken hiccup. "I love you, really." "I love you too," she said, kissing the top of his head. "And I promise I won't leave you, and I never break promises. Ever." "You'll leave me one day, though," she added softly, when Arthur was asleep. They waited in the queue at the ticket sales desk. The airport was hot and incredibly busy. So many airlines, so many destinations. Arthur read them off the departure board. Paris, Rome, Lisbon, New York, London Heathrow. "I think we should have bought these tickets earlier," Missy said, looking uncharacteristically distracted. Arthur yawned extravagantly. "Ich langweile mich," he said. "At least I learnt some German." "Yes, you've done very well, Arthur," Missy said vaguely. "Are you all right?" The Lufthansa sales clerk regarded Miss's request for 2 single tickets to Hamburg with solemnity. She would gladly sell her them, she said, but all the Hamburg flights were full until that evening. Did she still want to go? "How about London?" Missy asked. "I can get you on the next flight to Heathrow," the sales clerk said, "but not sitting together." "It will be quicker for us to just go straight home," Missy said to Arthur. Arthur said. Missy thought about buying a ticket for London. She thought for rather a long time, so that the sales clerk grew agitated because of the long queue snaking and coiling and knotting behind Arthur and Missy. "Arthur," Missy said finally, "have you ever been to Rome?" "I don't think so." "I can get you on a connecting flight to Rome leaving in half an hour," the sales clerk said hopefully. "A lot of museums in Rome," Arthur said. "A lot," Missy agreed. "And there are other places too," Arthur said. "Oh yes," Missy agreed. "There are many places, so many places that you need never come back to where you started from." "Which was Primrose Hill," Arthur said. He tugged at Missy's hand. "What about China?" "China?" the sales clerk asked, looking agitated. "Don't panic," Missy said to him. "From the great god Pan, now dead, thank goodness." "I don't know about China," Missy said solemnly to Arthur. "I'm afraid her fate may be to stay with Romney." "You're going to have to hurry," the sales clerk said. "The gate will be closing soon." They ran. They ran so fast Arthur was sure they were going to take off before they even got on the plane. Missy pulled him along by the hand, and when he looked at her feet, her sensible leather boots had turned into silver sandals, and he wondered if that was why they were able to run so fast. The airport tannoy stopped announcing that passengers for Dusseldorf should go to the gate, and instead broadcast the rousing sound of a hunting horn. For a few dizzy seconds, Arthur saw the quiver of silver arrows on Missy's back, gleaming with moonshine. He saw her green, wolfish eyes light up with amusement as she shouted, "Come on, Arthur! Hurry up!" while a pack of hounds bayed and boiled around her silver, sandaled feet, eager for the chase. right, everybody. Thank you so very much for being here. It's been very relaxing for me. I found it very pleasant, although it's extremely warm in this room, so I wouldn't mind, I think, getting outside, getting a little bit of fresh air, stretching my legs a little bit. I think I'm going to go for a little dip in the lake, have a swim in the lake. That's just about a 10-minute walk away from my apartment here, and just have a leisurely little evening before bed. Oh, thank you, Casper. You're very kind. Lovely to have you in the streams, Casper. Really, really nice to have you here. I hope to see you again next time. I will look to stream again next weekend, either Saturday or Sunday. Yeah, I'll try different things out, so I'm not sure. But I will schedule it, so look out for that popping up into your subscriptions feed. Definitely look to stream one of those days, and we'll have 2 or 3 more stories from this little anthology, I think. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you for being here. Stay foxy. All right. Take care. Read to you soon. Sayonara.